Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing construction disasters in American railway history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that claimed dozens of lives across 3 brutal years, where immigrant workers building America's future defied all warnings about cursed land and left a legacy so dark that the railroad company chose to bury the records rather than acknowledge what happened in those mountains. It was the year 1893. The nation was gripping itself through the panic of 1893, one of the worst economic depressions in American history. Banks collapsed, businesses shuttered, unemployment soared past 20%. Yet, in the remote wilderness of northern Idaho, along the jagged spine of the Bitterroot Mountains, construction continued on what locals had already begun calling the Devil's Railroad. The St. Mary's and Northern Railway was supposed to be a triumph of industrial engineering, a 16-mile stretch of track that would connect the mining towns of the Idaho Panhandle to the main transcontinental lines, opening up millions of dollars in silver and timber resources. The investors in Chicago and San Francisco saw only profit margins and geological surveys. They never walked those mountains. They never felt the oppressive silence that hung over the construction sites. They never heard the warnings. But the workers heard them, and one by one they began to disappear. The Bitterroot Mountains are not forgiving terrain. Rising abruptly from the dense forests of Idaho's panhandle, these peaks create a natural barrier between the state and Montana, their granite faces carved by ancient glaciers into sharp ridges and impossibly deep ravines. In summer, the slopes explode with wildflowers and the deceptive beauty of alpine meadows. But for 9 months of the year, these mountains belong to winter, a savage, relentless season where temperatures plummet to 30 below zero and snowdrifts can bury a man standing upright. The proposed railway route followed what the Coeur d'Alene tribe called the Shadow Path, a natural corridor through the mountains that indigenous peoples had avoided for generations. The tribal elders told the survey teams in 1890, 1. That the path was cursed, that spirits dwelled in the granite caves dotting the mountainside, that men who lingered too long in those shadows never returned whole. The surveyors, educated men from Yale and Harvard with their transits and theodolites, dismissed such warnings as superstition. They saw only favorable gradients and relatively stable geology. They were wrong about the geology. Construction began in April of 1892. The company recruited workers from across the American West and beyond. Irish immigrants fleeing poverty, Chinese laborers who'd helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, Scandinavian timber workers accustomed to harsh conditions, and desperate American men willing to work for $1.50 a day during the worst depression in memory. By May, nearly 200 men lived in work camps strung along the proposed route, housed in canvas tents and rough timber barracks that offered minimal protection from the elements. The camps themselves were brutal affairs. Men slept on wooden planks with thin bedrolls, 12 to a tent. They rose before dawn to work 12-hour shifts, swinging pickaxes and sledgehammers, drilling blast holes into granite, laying track across terrain that seemed determined to reject human intrusion. The food was monotonous: beans, salted pork, hard bread, and weak coffee. Injuries were constant. A man could lose fingers to frostbite, legs to rock slides, or his life to any number of accidents that plagued railway construction. But the men could endure hardship. What they couldn't endure was the feeling that they were being watched. Camp 3 sat at mile marker 7, nestled in a narrow valley where the proposed track had to cut through a granite outcropping too massive to go around. The foreman, a thick, shouldered Scotsman named Duncan Macready, had overseen railway construction from Colorado to California. He'd survived vins, dynamite accidents, and labor disputes. He was not a man given to fear or fancy. Yet even Mac Reddy felt it, that oppressive weight in the air around Camp 3. The way sound seemed to die in that valley, as if the mountains absorbed every noise. The uncanny silence that descended each evening once the hammering stopped. No birds, no wind rustling through the pines, no scurrying of small animals. Just silence, suffocating, unnatural, wrong. The men felt it too. They talked in hushed voices after dark, speaking of shadows that moved independently of any light source, of whispers in languages none of them recognized, of the peculiar coldness that settled over the camp at night even during summer months. Some men claimed to see figures standing at the tree line, tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that vanished when looked at directly. Superstitious nonsense. Mac Reddy declared when the men brought their concerns to him, "You're tired and jumpy. Work hard, sleep sound, and these phantoms will disappear." But the men kept disappearing instead. It started with Olaf Eriksson, a Norwegian timber worker assigned to the blasting crew. On June 14, 1892, Eriksson told his tent mates he was going to relieve himself before bed. He walked toward the latrine trench at the camp's edge, his lantern casting long shadows through the pine trees. He never returned. The next morning, Mac Reddy organized a search party. 30 men spread out through the surrounding forest, calling Eriksson's name, searching for any sign of the missing worker. They found his lantern approximately 200 yards from camp, sitting upright on a flat rock, still burning despite having been outside all night. The ground around it showed no signs of struggle, no footprints led away from the spot. Eriksson had simply vanished. He probably got disoriented and wandered off. Mac Reddy told the men, "Fell into a ravine in the dark. We'll find him when the body starts to smell." They never did. 3 days later, 2 Chinese laborers working the night shift loading supply wagons failed to report for their morning meal. Their names were Chen Wai and Liu Bao, brothers who'd worked railways across the West for nearly a decade. Experienced men, careful men, the kind who didn't make mistakes. Their workstation was found undisturbed, tools neatly arranged, a half-eaten apple sitting on a supply crate, a cup of cold tea beside it. Everything suggested they'd simply stood up and walked away mid-task. The only unusual detail was a peculiar smell reported by the men who found the abandoned station something sharp and mineral, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with an underlying scent of decay. Mac Reddy's frustration turned to genuine concern. 2 disappearances might be coincidence. 5 missing men in less than a week suggested something more sinister. He wrote to the company headquarters in Coeur d'Alene, requesting additional security personnel and better lighting for the camps. The response came 10 days later: maintain production schedule, missing workers likely deserted for better opportunities, reduce wages accordingly to cover losses. The investors didn't understand. Men don't desert $1.50 a day job during a depression, not without taking their belongings, not without telling anyone, not into wilderness where the nearest town is 40 miles away through mountain passes that can kill an experienced outdoorsman. But the disappearances continued. By August, 12 men had vanished from Camp 3. The pattern was always the same: men disappeared during twilight hours or at night, leaving no trace, no struggle, no logical explanation. The surviving workers grew increasingly agitated. Some packed their belongings and hiked out despite owing the company money for supplies. Others stayed but refused to work after dark. Production slowed to a crawl. Mac Reddy knew he was losing control of the situation. He also knew something else. Whatever was taking his men was connected to the excavation work at mile marker 7. Every disappearance occurred within a quarter-mile radius of the massive granite outcropping they'd been blasting for weeks. The same outcropping the Coeur d'Alene had warned them about. In September, Macready made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the blasting crew to double their explosive charges and bring down the entire face of the outcropping in one massive detonation. Whatever's in there, he told his second in command, we'll bury it or blast it to hell. Either way it ends. The blast was scheduled for September 23rd at dawn. The entire camp evacuated to a safe distance 300 yards away. The head blaster, an Irishman named Seamus O'Malley, personally checked every charge, every wire, every connection. 200 pounds of dynamite, carefully placed in holes drilled deep into the granite. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, O'Malley twisted the detonator handle. The explosion was colossal. The granite face shattered in a cloud of dust and flying rock that rose 200 feet into the morning air. The sound echoed through the mountains like thunder, sending birds erupting from trees for miles around. The workers cheered. Macready allowed himself a grim smile. Then the dust began to settle, and they saw what they'd uncovered. Behind the granite face, revealed now like a wound torn open, was a cave. But this was no natural formation. The entrance was enormous, 30 feet high and nearly as wide, opening into darkness that their lights couldn't penetrate. The walls weren't rough stone but smooth, almost polished, with strange regularity to their angles that suggested purpose rather than geological accident. More disturbing were the marks. Covering the visible interior walls were deep gouges scored into the rock parallel lines, each set appearing to be made by something with 4 or 5 claws. The gouges ran in repeating patterns, hundreds of them, thousands, covering every visible surface in a chaotic tangle of scratches that made the eyes hurt to follow. Macready felt ice settle in his stomach. Whatever made those marks hadn't done it recently. The grooves were ancient, worn smooth by time, but clearly visible even through decades or centuries of accumulated dust. Nobody goes in there, he ordered. We seal it back up, bring down the overhanging rock and bury this thing. But it was already too late. That night, 7 men disappeared. The survivors reported hearing sounds coming from the direction of the exposed cave. A low, rhythmic noise that seemed to resonate in their chests rather than their ears. Some described it as breathing, others as grinding stone. Several men claimed to see movement in the darkness of the cave entrance, shapes that defied description, forms that hurt to look at directly. By morning, Camp 3 was in full revolt. Half the remaining workers had fled during the night. The others refused to go near the excavation site. Macready stood alone on the hillside overlooking the exposed cave, watching morning light fail to penetrate its depths, and finally accepted the truth he'd been avoiding. They'd awakened something, and it was hungry. Macready's telegram to company headquarters was blunt. Work cannot continue at Camp 3. Recommend abandoning this route. Will explain in person. The response came within hours. Explanation required immediately. Board of Directors arriving by rail October 2nd. When the directors arrived, 3 wealthy men in expensive suits who'd never spent a night under canvas, Macready took them directly to the site. He showed them the cave. He showed them the marks. He provided detailed accounts of the disappearances, complete with names, dates, and witness statements. The directors were unimpressed. Accidents happen in railway construction, said Jonathan Prescott, the lead investor. Men desert. They get drunk and fall in ravines. You're asking us to abandon a $7 million investment because of scratches in a cave. "Those aren't scratches," MacReady said quietly. "And those men didn't desert." "Then where are they?" Prescott demanded. "Show me bodies. Show me evidence of foul play. Otherwise, I see incompetent supervision and superstitious workers." MacReady had no answer. There were no bodies, no evidence, only the growing list of missing men and the collective testimony of frightened workers. The directors gave him an ultimatum: resume full construction within 48 hours or face dismissal and legal action for breach of contract. They refused to authorize any delay, any investigation, any deviation from the schedule. The railroad would be completed. The cave was irrelevant. That night, Jonathan Prescott disappeared. The directors had insisted on staying at Camp 3 to assess the situation firsthand. They were given MacReady's own cabin, the most substantial structure in camp. Guards were posted. Lanterns burned bright. Every precaution was taken. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, the guards heard Prescott scream. They rushed into the cabin to find his 2 fellow directors awake and terrified. But Prescott was gone. The cabin door was still barred from the inside. The windows were shuttered. There was no way out, except for the smell. That same sharp, mineral scent mixed with decay. And beneath Prescott's empty bed, they found marks, deep gouges in the wooden floorboards, as if something with claws had reached up through solid wood and dragged him down. The remaining directors left at first light, riding hard for the nearest telegraph office. Within a week, the entire St. Mary's and Northern Railway project was suspended. The workers were paid off and sent away. The camps were dismantled. Camp 3 was abandoned entirely, left to rot in the mountain wilderness. But MacReady stayed. He couldn't leave. Not with 23 men missing and no answers. Not with Prescott's screams still echoing in his memory. He spent 3 days preparing. He gathered lanterns, rope, weapons, and supplies. He wrote letters to his family and sealed them with instructions to be opened if he didn't return. Then, on October 9, 1892, Duncan MacReady entered the cave alone. His journal, discovered 6 months later by timber surveyors, provides the only account of what he found inside. The entries are increasingly frantic, written in failing light with a hand that grew shakier with each page. October 9th, morning. The cave extends much further than visible from outside. Walls maintain their smooth, unnatural quality. The scratches are everywhere. Something made its home here. Something lived here for a very long time. October 9th, afternoon found the first body at approximately 300 yards in. Norwegian, Erickson, I think, though difficult to identify, not decomposed as expected, desiccated, completely dry, like he'd been exposed to desert air for months, not the damp interior of a cave. No obvious cause of death. October 9th, evening. 7 more bodies, same condition, all workers from Camp 3, arranged in a circle around a central chamber. MacReady's description of the chamber defies rational explanation. He writes of angles that don't exist in normal geometry, of surfaces that reflect light in ways that hurt the eyes, of a sense that the space is somehow larger inside than its physical dimensions allow. October 9th, night. I understand now. This isn't a cave, it's a dwelling, and it's very, very old. The marks aren't random, they're language, communication, a warning, perhaps, or a claim of territory, and somewhere deeper, something is waiting. I can hear it breathing, feel its attention. It knows I'm here. October 10th, unknown time. I found Prescott, still alive, barely. He's been changed, hollowed out. He's trying to speak, but the words aren't English, aren't any human language. His eyes are wrong. Everything about him is wrong. I need to leave, I need to get out, but I can't remember which direction I came from. The tunnels keep changing, the angles won't stay still, and the breathing is getting closer. The journal entries end there. Macready's body was never found. The St. Mary's and Northern Railway was permanently abandoned in November of 1892. The company declared bankruptcy, citing unexpected geological challenges and labor difficulties. The investors lost everything. The true story of what happened at Camp 3 was buried under layers of legal proceedings and corporate obfuscation. But the mystery couldn't be contained entirely. Too many men had witnessed the disappearances. Too many families demanded answers about missing workers. Too many reporters started asking uncomfortable questions. In January of 1893, a special investigator from the Idaho territorial government was sent to examine the site. His name was Marcus Webb, a former Pinkerton detective with a reputation for thoroughness and skepticism. He spent 2 weeks at the abandoned camp, interviewing surviving workers who'd returned to collect belongings, examining records, and exploring the surrounding area. Webb's official report is a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. It attributes the disappearances to a combination of industrial accidents, workers deserting employment, and adverse environmental conditions including rock slides and severe weather. It makes no mention of the cave, no mention of the scratches, no mention of the unnatural circumstances surrounding each disappearance. But Webb kept a private journal. Upon his death in 1927, his family discovered it among his effects. The entries from his Idaho investigation tell a different story. January 14, 1893. I've seen the cave. I've read Macready's journal. I've spoken to men who witnessed things no sane person would believe. The official report will state what my superiors want to hear, but I will write the truth here, for whoever finds these words after I'm gone. Something ancient dwells in those mountains, something that predates human settlement of this continent. The Coeur d'Alene knew. They tried to warn us. We didn't listen. January 18, 1893. I sealed the cave entrance with dynamite, brought down the surrounding rock face, buried it under 10,000 tons of granite. But I don't think it matters. You can't kill something like that. You can only contain it. Hope it stays sleeping, and pray that no one ever digs deep enough to wake it again. Webb's actions were recorded as necessary demolition of unstable rock formations threatening future travelers. The site was marked on territorial maps as landslide zone avoid, and eventually forgotten as more pressing concerns occupied the growing state. But the workers who survived Camp 3 never forgot. They carried the memory with them across the American West, telling their stories in the informal networks of itinerant laborers. Some warned others away from railway construction in Idaho. Some developed insomnia, jumping at shadows for the rest of their lives. Several committed suicide within 5 years of leaving the camp. One survivor, a Chinese laborer named Zhang Feng, returned to his family in San Francisco and never spoke again. He lived another 47 years in complete silence, communicating only through written notes. When he died in 1939, his family found a single sentence carved into the wooden beam above his bed. The mountain remembers. The mountain is patient. The families of the missing men received no compensation, no official acknowledgement, no answers. 23 men, fathers, brothers, sons, were simply erased from history. Their names appear in no memorial. No monument marks their passing. The land where Camp 3 once stood remained undeveloped for over a century. The forest reclaimed it quickly, pine trees growing through the remains of tent platforms, underbrush covering the railroad grade that was never completed. By the 1920s, no physical evidence remained that hundreds of men had once lived and worked there. But the local Coeur d'Alene tribe remembered. They continued to avoid the shadow path. They continued to tell their children that the spirits in those mountains were not to be disturbed. And when asked about the old railway project, the tribal elders would simply shake their heads and say, they should have listened. The story of the Devil's Railroad remains a disturbing reminder that some places on this earth belong to forces we don't understand and cannot control. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of 23 lives. It was the arrogance that put them in danger. The assumption that human industry, human progress, human ambition could override millennia of indigenous knowledge and natural warning. But questions remain that haunt anyone who studies this dark chapter of railway history. What exactly was in that cave? What created those marks? What happened to the men who disappeared, not just the physical mechanics of their vanishing, but what became of them? Macready's journal suggests something beyond death, some transformation or consumption that defies our understanding of mortality. And perhaps most disturbing, is it still there? To this day, the area where Camp 3 once stood is marked on modern topographical maps with an unusual designation: restricted zone, geological instability. But hikers who have ventured into the area report that the terrain seems perfectly stable. The real restriction, some suggest, is to prevent anyone from digging too deeply, from disturbing what Marcus Webb sealed beneath 10,000 tons of granite. Modern paranormal investigators have attempted to locate the site with limited success. The mountains of northern Idaho are vast and largely unchanged since the 19th century. Without precise coordinates, which were deliberately obscured in official records, finding the exact location of Camp 3 is nearly impossible. Some say that's intentional. Some say the mountain itself protects its secrets. But on silent nights, when the wind moves through the Bitterroot pines in just the right way, locals in the small towns dotting the Idaho Panhandle report hearing sounds carried down from mountains, a low, rhythmic noise that resonates in the chest rather than the ears, something that might be wind through rock formations, or might be something else entirely, something breathing, something patient, something waiting for the next group of humans foolish enough to disturb its rest. The indigenous peoples of this continent carried knowledge passed down through countless generations, understanding of the land, awareness of places where the barrier between worlds grew thin, wisdom about boundaries that should not be crossed. European colonizers dismissed this knowledge as primitive superstition. The Devil's Railroad is just one of many cautionary tales about the price of that dismissal. In our modern age of geological surveys and environmental assessments of ground, penetrating radar and seismic studies, we believe we've mapped every inch of this continent. We believe we understand what lies beneath the surface. The story of Camp 3 suggests otherwise. It reminds us that there are still mysteries in the earth, still dark places where human understanding fails, still ancient things that were here long before us and will remain long after we're gone. If this journey through one of railway history's darkest chapters resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering what really happened in those Idaho mountains and what might still lurk beneath the rock, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with respect and thoroughness. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on humanity's relationship with the natural world and the ancient forces we barely comprehend. Have you encountered places that felt fundamentally wrong? Locations where the boundary between the known and unknown seemed dangerously thin? Share your experiences. These stories matter. These warnings matter. Until next time, remember, some paths were marked as forbidden for good reason. Some warnings should be heeded, and some mountains hold secrets that humanity was never meant to uncover. This has been the Untold Hour.